Hi, here's a discussion on the recent changes to the UK Constitution, whether or not these reforms have been inadequate or effective. So we're going to analyse and evaluate this statement. I'm going to talk through a 25-mark question, and what I'm going to do is use the usual model, which is I'll bring forward an introduction. I'll have 3 key points that I'll discuss in favour and against in a balanced way, and then I'll get round to the conclusion. So, first things first, if you have this slide, it's not bad to revise off. What it does is show you the recent reforms that have occurred, the wide-ranging reforms that have occurred to our Constitution, to varying levels of extent, I would argue. The P's and the C's there are the pros and the cons of each of these changes, which it helps us, I think, in discussing whether or not these reforms have really had the impact that they were hoping to have. Okay, let's get into it. So the question's asking us whether or not recent reforms have been inadequate, not good enough. First of all, always define your terms. Easy that way to get started by talking about what a constitution is. It's a set of rules that outlines the working of the political system. The debate sits around whether or not Labour's 1997 election manifesto, which brought forward key constitutional reforms in the areas of devolution, House of Lords, the creation of the Supreme Court eventually, whether or not these have actually made a big significant difference, and whether or not they've truly improved the system as a whole. And that's really where your essay is lying at, looking at these 3 areas and making that judgment call. Okay, our first area of discussion is really the bring about of devolution in 1997, with the idea that they were trying to devolve power from central government to the regions and therefore increase the accountability you would find at that level. So devolution is quite significant, certainly in terms of the powers that it's given to the Welsh Assembly, the Northern Irish Assembly, the Scottish Parliament, and also to London. The impact of this in terms of the political system is to make it more democratic. It's allowed for changes in the electoral systems and regional approaches to specific issues, such as you can talk about agriculture, you can talk about education, you can put it in a modern context, and you can talk about the COVID pandemic and the fact that different regional assemblies have dealt with COVID in different ways and had different roadmaps, if you like, about how to get out of COVID. The argument against this, of course, is down to the inconsistent nature of devolution, as would be the case. You have different powers. The Scottish Parliament enjoys significantly more power through its tax-raising powers than perhaps other assemblies. So in terms of the West Lothian effect, there's a real issue there about English assemblies not having being created, and therefore we have a situation where the Westminster Parliament is for English MPs, but also Scottish MPs go there, but they've also got a Scottish Parliament. So these anomalies create confusion, and has actually led to the Supreme Court having to define where power truly exists. Brexit's even enhanced this further with the problems with Northern Ireland that we see at this moment in time, and when the boundaries are and how relationships work in terms of trade. And as I said before, there are raised questions about whether or not we actually need more regional assemblies across the whole country. So in many ways, the creation of initial devolved assemblies has allowed a growth of participation and accountability, but has also begged the question of what's the final nature of the settlement going to be. The second reform to analyse is really the House of Lords, and whether or not the House of Lords reform has made it more legitimate in the modern age. The argument in favour, of course, is the removal of hereditary peers, a massive step forward in terms of the change in the composition, which was thought at the time to be part of a process which would allow the House to become more democratic as a result. It certainly got rid of the Conservative dominance, it's a more balanced chamber, and of course it's always had crossbenchers in there. The benefits has been shown by a more challenging House of Lords, a Lords that's willing to take on the government on specific areas, such as religious hatred, for example, is a classic case of that. And recent governments not having majorities have maybe emboldened their Lords further because they've felt that they can actually go beyond the Salisbury Doctrine. Against this is the case that it was the first stage. It was only a partial change, and we haven't seen Parliament move to being a completely elected chamber as a whole yet. So it's still a contentious issue. Some would argue that we want something like the US Senate, which is totally elected. Some would argue that the powers of the House of Lords still remain quite limited as well. So in terms of reform, it's really quite a limited one overall, but there's a lack of consensus over the reform of the Lords, and whether or not what it is at this present time is adequate to allow us to have primacy of the House of Commons is perhaps the evaluation you would want to make. Finally, we're looking at the issue of rights and the balance in the Constitution and the creation of the Supreme Court. And with legislation around rights in the Supreme Court being put in place in 2005 and before that point, what we've seen is some significant moves forward in terms of reforms, which you could argue to be much more adequate than they were. Whether or not they got adequate enough really comes into the discussion of the evidence. So we can talk about the increase in judicial review, which you've seen through the Supreme Court coming forward. The good cases that have been recently shown where they've challenged the executive over Article 50, but also the prorogation of Parliament, all suggest that perhaps the reform of the Supreme Court has been an asset in challenging executive power. However, you would challenge that by saying the Supreme Court is still quite restricted in the power that it has. Executive power is still evident in the way in which a government can control the Commons and therefore bring forward legislation and actions that perhaps the Supreme Court would find difficult to really challenge effectively. So what we've seen is the government, when in its position of crisis, for example, such as COVID, has been able to work quite powerfully without real check from the Supreme Court. So in evaluation, you would have to argue there's been a change in the culture in the political system. The emergence of rights is much more relevant and prevalent at this moment in time. But the actual power, because of parliamentary sovereignty and the way in which the government can control that, has perhaps not been there. Which takes us to a conclusion. What do we think? Have the reforms been inadequate, which is what the statement's saying? Well, if you're arguing that they have been inadequate, you would have to acknowledge the fact there have been significant alterations with the evolution House of Lords Supreme Court. If you are arguing they've been adequate, you'd have to acknowledge the fact that perhaps reforms have never satisfied those who need a more comprehensive constitutional reform, who would argue for a written constitution as a means of bringing the country forward into the modern age. If you are arguing in favour of it and saying they are inadequate, you'd probably be stressing the fact that the reforms have yet to solve the balance of the constitutional statement between central and regional governments, and actually the balance between executive power and individual rights. If you're arguing against and saying, well, this is as good as we can expect, the reforms have been appropriate. And this is the point that the constitutions are rarely perfect. What they are is evolving documents. And actually having a constitution which allows us to evolve in a timely fashion is probably the right way. And the reforms that we've had have been what people have wanted at that time, and there's been a consensus behind, and as a result, that's why they've occurred. There you go. Thanks very much.